Hi, and welcome to the CDFM study group. My name is Helen Thomas, and today what I want to do is to do a question and answer period for CDFM Module 2. So I'll just ask some questions, I'll kind of pause, then give you the response so that when you're doing your studies, you can listen to the question, pause the video, try to answer it for yourself, then listen to the rest of the video to get the actual response. This should help you as you finalize your study period for CDFM Module 2. So we're going to start with operational chain of command in the federal budget process. Where does the operational chain of command run? The operational chain of command runs from the President to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders directly. So that's the chain of command when it comes to operations. And then you have the National Security Council. So the National Security Council is made up of a few important individuals. The President of the National Security Council is the President of the United States. And on the National Security Council, you have some statutory members, some individual that's always on that council. The National Security Council is made up of the President, Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of Energy and Water. Those are the statutory members. And you also have two advisors to the National Security Council. And what are they? Director of Intelligence and the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. That is correct. So what is the document? So the National Security Council, which is the highest individuals in our country, they develop the National Security Strategy. That's correct. So you can think of the NSS document, the National Security Strategy, as our big op order. Remember, operational order, when you get an operational order, what do you do with it? You take it, you read through it, and you look for the areas that apply to you. So the Department of Defense takes that National Security Strategy op order, for lack of a better word, and then they look for all the defense-related tasks in that order. And the National Defense Strategy is then developed. The defense strategy is developed to meet that national security strategy. And so, in order for the Department of Defense to accomplish all its mission to meet that strategy, DoD uses three systems. What are the three DoD support systems that overlap, work together to help develop the Quadrennial Defense Review? That is JCITS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, the PPBE process, planning, programming, budgeting, and execution, and the third is the Defense Acquisition System. So let's talk about JCITS, Joint Capability Integration and Development System. What is the purpose of JCITS, doing that analysis? So once we know what our mission is, what our strategy is, what we need to get done in the DoD to accomplish the defense strategy to meet the national security strategy, then we have to do a capability analysis. That's what JCITS does. So we want to look in our inventory, want to see this is what we need done. This is the mission we need to get done. These are the capabilities that we have. So we look at our doctrine, our organization, that's called the .MLPF, all of those categories, training, personnel, facilities, material. And once we pinpoint what's going to fill that, then we figure out where our capability gaps are. So once we determine our capability gaps, then we can determine whether we go into the PPBE process to get the funding for it, or we enter into the acquisition system. So what is the trigger for us to activate the acquisition or enter the acquisition system? So if the JCIDS result or recommendation is a material solution, that is what triggers the acquisition system. So remember, those three systems overlap together. So who is the executor of JCIDS, the Joint Capability Integration and Development System? I'm doing this because you do not want to just memorize the acronym. You need to know what the acronym stands for, because you can be easily confused if all your responses say JCIDS, but it's different words used. So make sure you know what the acronyms stand for. Again, back to my question. Who is the executor of JCIDS? That is the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Because don't forget, what's the function of the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff? That is the top military. Your President is civilian, your Secretary of Defense is a civilian, your top military advisor is your Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So that advisor advises the President, the National Security Council, and the Secretary of Defense. And remember, when we said the operational chain of command runs President, Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders, but how does the communication get from SecDef and President to the combatant commanders? They go through the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. That's the subject matter expert for the military in that government organization. So it makes sense that all the communication from the top two individual goes through the chairman, goes to the combatant commanders. All right, so we said the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the executor of JCIDS. What is the board or the council that is responsible for the JCIDS process? So you have the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff being the head of JCIDS, but there's a board or a council that he sits on that actually does that analysis. And that is called JROC, the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. So the JROC is the council, is the board, chaired by the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and they conduct the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. And all that is a bunch of analysis to figure out where are our capability gaps and what. Don't just bring me the problem, bring me a solution. What is it going to take to fill that capability gap? When we go to the PPBE process, we receive a document from the combatant commanders where they identify their needs, their capability needs, their requirements. What is the document created, developed by the combatant commanders? The IPLs, Integrated Priority List. So the combatant commanders submit the IPLs to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, the SecDef, the Deputy SecDef, and the military department that's going to be responsible for that. To give them all a heads up, they all get a copy. Again, your subject matter expert, top military advisor, is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So the purpose of the chairman is then to take what those combatant commanders submit, analyze it, and make sure that it's still in line with the defense strategy, and the defense strategy must still be in line with what? The national security strategy. We got to make sure that what we're asking for, what we require, is in line with the Higher Command's op order, which is the national security strategy. And so when the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff gets a request, the chairman does his assessment, and then the chairman provides his recommendation to the Secretary of Defense. There's also a document created by the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. What is that document called? It is the National Military Strategy. Because again, if my chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is my subject matter expert, I need to get that input from the chairman, which is the NMS document, National Military Strategy. So think about it. Your SecDef gets input from all the subject matter expert, and then policy and guidance comes from the SecDef. Our policies and guidance comes from the Secretary of Defense, not the chairman. So the chairman's input is his assessment, his recommendation, the National Military Strategy. The SecDef takes everybody's input, including the chairman, and issues that 4-year strategic plan, which is the Quadrennial Defense Review, strategic guidance, homeland security, what all the different defense-related policies and guidance that we need. The planning phase, which extends over a long period of time, is the responsibility of which section, which office, which individual in the DoD. Planning is the responsibility of the USD for policy, Under Secretary of Defense for policy. The purpose of the planning phase of PEEP is to develop the plan that will meet the national security strategy, making sure everything is in line. What is the final document created by the DoD at the end of the planning phase? That is the Defense Planning Guidance, or it may be called Defense Planning and Programming Guidance, the DPG or the DPPG. Same thing. So that's what's issued. And prior to the programming phase, we receive guidance from the individual that is responsible for programming and budget, because remember, those two phases occur simultaneously. So Director of CAPE, Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, the DCAPE, is responsible for programming. So he issues a combined POM and budget estimate submission, POM and BEST guidance. The budget side is the responsibility of whom? The USD Comptroller. So the DCAPE and the USD Comptroller both issue a combined POM BEST guidance. Give us guidance before we start that POM process. So in the POM process, in the programming phase, that's where we translate the plan into allocation of resources. We need to start prioritizing things, so we need to actually come up with the plan, the programs that we need to accomplish that capabilities. So again, your commands, your military components submit their POM. How does the information from the combatant commanders get included in the POM? Combatant commanders must submit their POM requirements to the component that is responsible. So if it's an Army asset that they need in the POM, they need to contact the Army. If it's a Navy asset, so component commanders, they don't do their own POM process. Combatant commanders do not do their own POM process. They have to go through the component commanders. Let me make sure I clear that up. So the same process goes to the chairman. The chairman reviews it, gives his recommendation, his assessment to make sure that everything, okay, yep, that we're following the guidance. Director of CAPE is introduction of the Future Year Defense Program. The FYDP FYDP is the DoD database that keeps track of all our decisions as we move along the PPBE process at the DoD level. The FYDP is the responsibility of whom? The DCAPE, the same guy that's in charge of programming, is in charge of updating this DoD database. I think the FYDP and the FYDP is the only time I've seen in the study guide where they use the word database. So FYDP, Future Year Defense Program, is the DoD database that ties together your appropriation, your resources, manpower, equipment, and all your services. Whoever's using it is keeping track of all that data is basically what it is. So programming, what is the final document published at the end of the programming phase? And it's actually in the name of the same document published at the end of the budgeting phase. The Resource Management Decision, RMDs. So on the budgeting side, which is the responsibility of whom? The USD Comptroller. So USD Comptroller is in charge of budgeting and the execution phase. So the same process goes up with the budget. The best budget estimate submission submitted, reviewed, assessed, recommendation. The budgeting phase translates those programs into appropriations, which is how it goes forward. So at the end of both of those phases, which occur at the same time, programming and budget, the final document that is reviewed by OMB and DoD in the fall review is called the Resource Management Decision. That is the budget, that's the program information that goes to OMB, Office of Management and Budget, for inclusion in what? Why are we submitting these things to OMB? For inclusion in the president's budget. As you remember, we have to get approval for the programs in the POM, and we also have to get approval for the budget. So when the president is required to submit the budget to Congress, when? No later than the first Monday in February. When the president submits the budget to Congress, what does Congress do with it? So in the budgeting phase, when the president submits to Congress, the Congressional Budget Office, remember, what do? What's a CBO? Congressional Budget Office, they have to do all the paperwork. Think of an accountant. They got to tell Congress, well, how much was our revenue? How much money did we take in? What's our deficit? What's our outlay? How much money did we spend? So the Congressional Budget Office captures all of that. Then Congress does a concurrent budget resolution. What that means is the House side and the Senate side have to then determine what guidelines they're going to use when they review the president's budget. So, which committee in Congress is responsible for the concurrent budget resolution? So that office is the House and Senate Budget Committee. All right, the second phase after the concurrent budget resolution, what is the next phase? The authorization process. So which office in Congress or committee is responsible for the authorization process? That is your House and Senate Armed Services Committee. And then the third phase is your appropriations process. The office in Congress responsible for that is your House and Senate Appropriation Committee. All right, so once Congress appropriates the money, what happens? Two things happen. The first legal thing to happen is the Treasury issues the Treasury warrant. Because remember, It says, Article 1, Section 9 of our Constitution says what? No money shall be drawn out to Treasury unless we have an appropriation law. So once we have the appropriation law, then the first legal action is the Treasury issuing the Treasury warrant, or it may be called the appropriation warrant. And what's the second thing that happens on the other side? OMB begins the apportionment process. So Congress appropriates, OMB apportions, and DOD issues allotments. So make sure that becomes important later. And then we commit and we obligate and we outlay funds, not disperse, use outlay. Outlay when funds are removed from the Treasury. And so going back to the defense acquisition system, we said when we're doing the analysis in JCIDS, you're looking at .mlpf, doctrine, organization, material. I'm looking at training. I'm looking at my facilities. And if the solution is a material solution, I need a new truck, I need a new aircraft, I need a new vehicle, those big ticket items, then it triggers the acquisition system, defense acquisition system. So who is the chairman of the defense acquisition system? The USD AT&L, Under Secretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. What is the name of the board that the USD AT&L uses, sits on, in order to do the acquisition process? That's the Defense Acquisition Board. Who is the co-chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board with the USD AT&L? That is the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So if you notice, that's the same person that's in charge of JCID, of coming up with the capability gaps and solution. The same guy, vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, he sits as co-chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board. Again, making sure that everything stays in line to meeting that national security strategy. So thank you, and we will continue this Q&A review in the next video.